Good afternoon, and thank you for coming on to the Patient Education and Empowerment webinar series presented by Sisters Network. Today's topic is Black women and clinical trials participation, and we are very excited to have you all tune in today. We have an esteemed panel today that's going to share some of their expertise and, of course, a personal experience with one of our survivor friends, and then some wisdom from our founder and CEO. We are just very grateful that we have close to 350 participants that have registered and signed on to hear this important topic. And so we know that Saturdays are your time to do some leisure activities with friends and family. So taking time out to hear and learn more about Black women in clinical trials and the importance of participation is very important. And we do sincerely appreciate that. Please know that we also are simulcasting on Facebook Live. So hello to our Facebook Live friends. We are grateful for you tuning in as well. As I mentioned, we have an esteemed group of panelists, and we also have an esteemed group of participants sorry, my light just went out. Anyway, esteemed group of the folks who have signed on today. We have such a broad and diverse group of registrants that I think it's important that we just acknowledge some of the groups and organizations that are here today. So first of all, I want to just acknowledge a lot of our chapter members that are on today. We have members from our Northeast Florida chapter, Central chapter, which is in Orlando, Tampa Bay, Chicago, Sisters Network Chicago chapter, Greater Metropolitan Detroit, River Rouge, Michigan, Essex County, New Jersey, Passaic, Bergen, New Jersey. The New York City chapter is present. Greensboro, North Carolina chapter is present, as well as the Triangle chapter, which is in Durham, North Carolina. Memphis and Nashville, Tennessee are on board, and our Austin and Dallas chapters. Hello to our Texas friends. And then Central Virginia chapter is on board today, so hello to you ladies. Southeast Wisconsin, which is one of our newer chapters, as well as our Southwest Georgia chapter that was just recently announced, and we'll be sharing information about Reading, Pennsylvania next week, but they are on board too, so welcome to those ladies. Those are two of our newest chapters and sister members, so we really appreciate you ladies being on board. But again, I mentioned that we have an esteemed, diverse group of participants. And just to name a few of the organizations that are represented, our friends from Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority, Top Ladies of Distinction, the Links Incorporated, National Congress of Black Women, National Black Nurses Association. We have representatives from American Cancer Society, Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance, the National Women of Achievement, Delaware Breast Cancer Coalition, I think I said, and National Institute of Health and National Cancer Institute, Moffitt Cancer Center, Mediviver, Stanford Health, Duke School of Medicine, Henry Ford Health System. I mean, the list goes on and on. Angels Surviving Cancer, Michigan Institute of Clinical and Health Research, Penrose Cancer Center, and many more, University of Michigan, Rogel Cancer Center, and Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center. So we are so appreciative of you all tuning in. And again, you're watching Black Women in Clinical Trial Participation, and special shout out to our sponsors who made this afternoon possible for Sisters Network to present: MERCK, who's been a wonderful friend of ours, and our new friend, Taiho Oncology, who is one of our new partners, and we're excited to work with this new oncology partner of ours, and this is the first partnership for us, and we're looking forward to many more. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. To introduce our panelists, and I will read through their bios, and then I will let Dr. Talani start with her presentation first, and then we'll move through the rest of the panelists. So Dr. Talani received her undergraduate degree from Princeton University in 1998, and her medical degree from UC San Francisco in 2002. Dr. Tolaney subsequently completed her residency in internal medicine at Johns Hopkins University and fellowships in hematology and medical oncology at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. She obtained a master's in public health from the Harvard School of Public Health in 2007, and in 2008, she joined the staff of Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Brigham and Women's Hospital, where she is a medical oncologist and clinical investigator in breast oncology in the Breast Oncology Center. Her research focuses on the development of novel therapies in the treatments of breast cancer. And that is Dr. Sarah Tolaney, and she will be presenting momentarily. Our next presenter will be our founder and CEO, Mrs. Karen Eubanks Jackson, who is the founder and CEO of Sisters Network Incorporated. She is a 28-year, 4-time breast cancer survivor, national breast cancer advocate, and an author of her book, In the Company of My Sisters, My Story, My Truth. She's been recognized nationally as a visionary and national leader in the Black breast cancer movement, and was the founder of Sisters Network, which is now the largest and only national Black breast cancer survivorship organization with over 25 chapters around the country, which I mentioned earlier. Mrs. Jackson started her personal fight with breast cancer back in '94 when she recognized the lack of sisterhood in traditional organizations that targeted breast cancer patients. She's often referred to as a breast cancer champion, and she was motivated to stop the silence and shame that breast cancer can often cause in the Black community and can immobilize many women, restricts their ability to receive support services, and interferes with early detection, and ultimately affects their survival rates. Mrs. Jackson has garnered many national and international awards for her work in breast health advocacy work. She's been recognized, with cancerhealth.com just most recently as one of the top 25 national leaders in the Black breast cancer movement with removing racial barriers, and BET, and many other awards that she's received. Mrs. Jackson has, she's been featured in numerous magazines and newspapers and internet media outlets. She is an honorary member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, a member of Houston, Texas chapter of Links Incorporated, and a lifetime member of the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, and a national member of the National Council of Negro Women. A leader and visionary, Karen E. Jackson continues to make a difference every day in the lives of African American women. She is committed to Sisters Network National Creed: in unity there is strength, in strength there is power, and in power there is change. And her new tagline is "Make your health your top priority." So Mrs. Jackson, we thank you for all that you do. And our final panelist, but last but never least, is Sheila M Mcglown. She is a 10-year MBC survivor and thriver and breast cancer advocate, and she is a 25-year Air Force veteran. Sheila is a powerful speaker with a compelling personal story. Sheila is a pioneering breast cancer advocate with a particular focus on the African American community. She has overcome personal adversity to help support and educate her community about the risk of breast cancer and how to live a fulfilling life after diagnosis. In 2009, at the age of 43, Sheila was looking forward to the next stage of life after retiring from her role as an Air Force senior master sergeant. During her 25 years of service, she received many accolades while serving in the military. Her plans were turned upside down when she was diagnosed with stage 4 HER2 positive ER plus invasive breast cancer. By the time she received her diagnosis, the tumor had already metastasized to her liver and rib. Since then, she has undergone intensive treatment, including a bilateral mastectomy and many, many rounds of intensive chemotherapy. This wasn't the first time that breast cancer had touched Sheila's life, unfortunately. Her beloved mother, Grace, died from metastatic breast cancer back in 2004. Ever since then, Sheila has been determined to carry on her mother's legacy, and her own diagnosis simply strengthened her commitment. She sees this mission of advocacy just as the oath of enlistment she took to defend our country with her life. Because of this, Sheila has built a strong and proud heritage in the breast cancer community. She uses her voice to raise awareness about racial disparities faced by Black women throughout their breast cancer journey. Receiving a breast cancer diagnosis is devastating for anyone, and Sheila passionately believes that racial disparities should not have an impact on the standard of treatment that Black women receive. Sheila has also taken part in a clinical trial, something that she feels is vitally important because Black women are underrepresented in clinical trials. So today we welcome Sheila and Dr. Sarah Taleni and Mrs. Jackson, and I will turn it over to Dr. Taleni, who will share her screen and give us a wonderful presentation and an overview of the importance of clinical trials. Dr. Taleni?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart as well, so I appreciate the opportunity to share my feelings on clinical trials and address some of the questions I think that are very commonly asked about trials. So I think just to start off with, what is a clinical trial? And I think this is sometimes confusing to patients because there's so many different types of clinical trials that it can, be hard to understand exactly what these actually represent. But in general, the idea is that trials are usually trying to address a particular question. So sometimes it's looking to see if a new treatment is effective in patients with breast cancer. And additionally, and very importantly, a lot of trials are also very focused on the safety, particularly when they're very novel agents and new agents that haven't been tested before. Sometimes that is the main endpoint of a trial, is assessing safety of a new drug. And so the way trials often start off with is usually very early on and then can progress. And so, for example, the way I think of it is sometimes someone in the laboratory realizes that a drug can work very potently on a particular cancer. So that's what I consider the preclinical phase, where there's exciting new evidence that a drug can effectively work in, let's say, breast cancer. And so once we get that very important signal, work is done usually on animal models to test that new agent, to assess not only efficacy of the new agent in a model of breast cancer, but also to assess the toxicity of the agent. And that work is done in order to understand what potential doses we may want to study in people. And then once we've done all that work and assessed safety and efficacy, usually in animal models, those drugs then move into what we call a phase 1 study. So a phase 1 trial sometimes, and we'll get into the differences here, but is a study that is looking at a new drug for the very first time in people. So if the drug's never been given before to a person, the primary endpoint is really to assess the safety of the drug. And so these trials can sometimes be a little complex because in order to assess safety, you have to often enroll small groups of patients at a time at a particular dose level, understand how that dose is tolerated. And if it's well tolerated in that small cohort of people, once all those patients have finished at least a cycle of therapy, then we can enroll new patients onto a higher dose level. And we keep doing this until we achieve what we think is the correct dose. And once we achieve that correct dose, then usually we enroll a larger number of patients in that correct dose to assess the safety in a larger group of people, but also to get a signal for the efficacy. But sometimes a phase 1 trial isn't just a study that's looking at a new drug that's being given to people for the very first time. Sometimes it's actually just looking at a combination of therapies for the first time. So you could take 2 FDA-approved drugs that have only been given individually to people, but now let's say you want to give them to people at the same time, then you need to go back and do a phase 1 study. So even again, these drugs, we know very well how they work, what their side effects are. When you're mixing them together for the first time, you still need to go back and do a phase 1 study to understand safety and toxicities. So there are lots of different flavors of phase 1 trials, and that's why I think it can become confusing. They're not always the very first time it's being given to a person. But their main goal, again, is to understand the safety of drugs and figure out the right dose of drugs. And once we know that, if it seems like the drug is well tolerated, is safe, and if there's a good signal for efficacy from the phase 1 studies, those drugs then will move into the phase 2 setting. So the phase 2 setting is really looking to establish the efficacy in a larger number of patients. So let's say I did a phase 1 trial of a new drug. It looked really good. It was well tolerated. We figure out what dose to give, and there was a signal that it was really working in the patients that were getting it. Then we're going to move it to a phase 2 trial, often enroll a large number of patients to really see what the signal is for efficacy. And if it then appears very promising, that it's really working very well, then we move it to a phase 3 setting. And usually what this is doing is it's saying, hey, we've got this new drug, let's call it drug X. We see that it works really well, but now we need to compare it to what is considered standard of care treatment in that particular setting. So we need to do a randomized study and compare drug X to what is thought to be standard care treatment and see who wins. And if new drug X wins and is better than the standard of care, that then usually will lead to FDA approval. But you can see it's a long road to get from a phase 1 trial to establish the safety of your drug, get phase 2 data, see what the efficacy is, and then get phase 3 data and compare it to standard of care. And so I think that's a challenge because obviously we want to get these drugs to people and become accessible as quickly as possible. And, you know, that takes years by the time a drug actually gets FDA approved. And again, I think that's one reason, and we'll get back to this, why participating in clinical trials is just so meaningful, because not only does it help us all understand how drugs work, and you're able to really have an impact on many patients by participating, but also it gets you access to a new drug much before it actually can get FDA approved. And that is really important considering how long it takes us to move a drug forward. So why would anyone want to participate in a clinical trial? So I think there are pros and cons that always need to be considered if you're thinking about a trial. Some of the pros, I think, are that if a new treatment is proven to work, and you get it on a trial, you're going to be among the very first patients to have access to the drug and benefit from that drug. And so that's clearly an advantage without having to wait until the drug is FDA approved. I think the other thing that I often think is very important when I'm helping patients make a decision is, you know, sometimes we only have a set number of drugs that we can choose from when we're treating a patient. And so I think of it like as a menu that I have when trying to select the right treatment from that menu. But when I have a clinical trial, I add another drug to that menu. So in essence, it's expanding the number of choices that we have as treatment options, which is important because we often, particularly when someone has metastatic disease, we're usually moving from one treatment to another over time. And it's nice to expand that menu so there are lots of choices on that list. And so again, it just adds more choices to our treatment decisions. And then additionally, I think it's important to realize that we're now getting to a point where we're a little smarter at developing new drugs. And so some of these drugs are more targeted and can decrease the number of side effects that drugs would normally have by delivering the drug in a smarter way. And so again, it could get you access to a drug that may not just be very effective, but potentially could be even less toxic than the standard treatment would be. And finally, I think, you know, really as a patient who's participating in a trial, you're making a huge contribution to helping others and really making large steps in terms of moving the needle and improving cancer care overall. Certainly, there are also downsides too. And I think one has to weigh this when making a decision. So sometimes, particularly when you're participating in a trial where a drug is really new, doctors don't always know all the side effects of those new drugs because we haven't given it that often and we haven't given it to a lot of patients. And so sometimes there can be unexpected side effects that we're just not aware of. And so you could be participating in a trial where we didn't really warn you that that's a potential side effect, and yet it is something that arises simply because we're just not aware of it because the drug is just so new. Also, one challenge and one thing I hope we will make strides towards improving is that clinical trials often can involve more visits than getting standard of care does. And this can be hard because there are trials, for example, that require patients not only come in more often, but sometimes need to hang out in clinic longer than they would normally, particularly phase 1 trials where we're trying to assess the right dose. Sometimes we do what we call pharmacokinetic blood draws, where we draw blood on regular intervals in the clinic to understand how the drug is getting metabolized so we can look at the drug level in the bloodstream. Well, that's really a pain for the patient because they're sitting around in the infusion chair sometimes for hours to be able to do these blood draws. And so that can really be a pain. And so it's really important when assessing a clinical trial, what exactly is being asked of you and how much is involved to see if it's really practical for you. Because again, all trials are different. Some are no different than the standard of care in terms of frequency of visits or time in the clinic. Some are even less often than you would normally do. But on the flip side, there can be trials that are more involved. And I think, again, that's important to weigh when you're trying to make a decision about whether it's just feasible for you to participate in. And then finally, I think even if a new treatment has benefits and really works very well for you, it's hard because not always will that be the case, right? You could sign up for a trial and maybe we say, well, most people have been benefiting from this drug. It seems really promising, but what if you're the one patient who's not deriving benefit from it? And so it is always a gamble with any therapy that we give, that we can't guarantee for an individual patient it is necessarily going to work. And I think that's also true with standard of care therapies, though. And again, that's what some of the challenges are, is it's not 100% guarantee that by doing a trial, it will necessarily work. So, I often get a lot of different questions when talking about clinical trials to patients. So I thought it might be helpful to just review some of the most commonly asked questions that I get. So the first question is when is the right time to consider a clinical trial? And I will say that I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the answer to this one, where in my mind, the right time is really any time. It isn't, I think some people have this notion in their head that you don't want to be doing a clinical trial until the doctor tells you there aren't any other options left, that this is like a last resort kind of a thing. And I will say that is far, far from the truth, that we have clinical trials for every step of the way when someone is trying to prevent getting breast cancer, when they've never even been diagnosed, to when they first get diagnosed and they're getting their very first therapies, to if it recurs and they're getting their first treatment or a treatment, many treatments in to their journey with metastatic disease. And so just realize there isn't a wrong or right time. The key thing I think to realize, though, is that you usually need to go on a trial when you're starting the therapy, that it's hard with most trials that if you've already started a treatment, most trials aren't doing an add-on to your current therapy. And so when making a treatment decision, it's important to weigh all your choices up front, whether it's a standard treatment or the clinical trial, and then make a decision when you start that treatment. So how do you find a clinical trial and figure out how to enroll onto it? And I will say this is something I find incredibly frustrating. And I think there are lots of movements trying to improve this because I think it needs to be done much better than it currently is. In my mind, the answer is to talk to your doctor, that is the best way to discuss clinical trials because your oncologist knows you, they know where things are with your disease, and they can help you navigate this. Because I will say it is hard to navigate on your own. There are sites online, but I will say they are tough. I've even plugged in patients to clinicaltrials.gov, which is sort of our national database of clinical trials. And, you put in a few keywords and it spits out a lot of trials, many of which are not even, the right match for a particular patient. And so I have patients who sometimes come in with like these huge printouts, many pages long of what came off of clinicaltrials.gov, and most of it isn't even applicable to them. And so I will say it's very hard. In my mind, I found it challenging to search easily, but the trials do live there. And so it is an incredible resource. It's just not very patient friendly for searching, with really coming up with exact trial matches. Breastcancertrials.org, I think, has been really nice and a tremendous resource to patients because it's a lot more patient friendly. And so a lot of patients do go on to that site as well. But I think the challenge is not everything lives in one place, and not everything lives in a place that is really easy to search. And so I think, again, talking to your oncologist, in my mind, is the best source for helping sort this out. Because again, I do think it is a challenge and one I think that needs to improve with time. So, once, let's say your doctor mentions a clinical trial and you think about it and you weigh it against what other treatment options there may be, what happens then? And how do you get on to a clinical trial? So generally speaking, what happens is that your oncologist will review the trial with you in detail to make sure that you really understand exactly what is involved and what is required of you and what is expected in terms of potential side effects. And if it seems like it is something you want to participate in, usually what happens is you sign a consent form. Realize that these forms are not binding in any way, that if you change your mind at any point in time, you can always withdraw off of a clinical trial. And whether it's before you've started, while you're on the treatment, it is not something you are bound to. You haven't signed a mortgage on your house or something like that. This is something that you can always change your mind on. And so let's say you've decided to move forward. Usually there are a bunch of screening tests that need to be done. Usually there's some strict criteria and trials that people need to meet certain eligibility. Your, for example, kidney function needs to be in a certain range, or your liver function needs to be in a certain range, or your heart function needs to be in a certain way. And so there are usually a bunch of tests that we have to do to make sure that a patient meets those criteria that are required to go onto the trial. And so we schedule all those tests and people go through them, and we make sure that they meet the eligibility criteria. And if so, then they go on to start the trial and are monitored while on that treatment. And so what is it like once you're on a trial? And it depends, because every trial is different. Some, again, are more intensive than others. Some are less intensive and in fact, even easier than maybe the standard therapy would be, but it's very specific to that trial. Most often there is a research team that is involved with monitoring the trial. For example, if you came to Dana-Farber, where I am at, when I see a patient on a trial, we often have a research nurse who joins into the visit with me, to make sure that we're assessing toxicities together and monitoring them. And so, in fact, your team grows a little bit when you're on a trial, which, I think in many cases, most patients love because it's just more resources to have as you go on to the study. One question I think that comes up that I think people worry about is, could you get a placebo? Meaning, could you get something that doesn't really have any drug in it? And I think the answer to that is a little complicated because it depends exactly on what trial you're going on to. For a patient with metastatic disease, we would never put someone onto a trial where the only treatment could be a placebo. That is not something that is ethical and not something that would ever be done. But there can be an add-on strategy that could be a placebo. So for example, let's say there's a drug that's a standard of care, and let's say the trial is trying to study if this extra drug, when added to the standard treatment, makes it work better. So sometimes there's a trial where they take the standard and add in the extra drug and compare it to the standard with a placebo. And so that case, again, there is a placebo trying to see if the add-on strategy is really working or not. And so there's this extra placebo that's added on. And so some trials can do that, where both the doctor and the patient are blinded to knowing exactly what they're getting. So in that example I gave, the patient and the doctor would know that the patient's definitely getting the standard of care treatment. They're getting that standard drug, but we wouldn't know if they're getting the extra drug or not, because again, we don't know if they're getting the placebo or the add-on drug. That's not always the case. Some trials don't have any placebos in them at all. But again, this would be explained all up front, when you go on to a study. So what if you change your mind? So let's say you decide to go on to the study and you say, actually, I don't want to do that anymore, or it's too complicated for me to get there that often. It's too far away from where I live, where the trial is functioning, and I just don't want to do it. Remember, at any time, this is always voluntary, so you can always change your mind, and you should never feel like that's something to worry about, that's always feasible for you. And then what about cost? Does participating in a clinical trial cost more than doing standard of care? In general, what happens with a trial is anything that would have been done standardly, like, normally I'd get patients' blood work before I, for example, give them chemotherapy. That normal, regular blood work that would be done would get billed to insurance. You seeing your doctor that you would normally do gets billed to insurance. If a drug is an investigational drug on a trial, it has to be provided for free on a trial. They can't bill you for a drug that's not FDA approved. But in general, most stuff on a trial that is standard of care gets billed to insurance, but anything that's extra or weird that wouldn't be standard of care would have to be charged to research. So for example, if a trial is drawing all these extra blood tubes to study something that isn't standard of care, those extra blood draws need to be billed to research. If the trial is requiring a biopsy of a tumor, that research biopsy has to be billed to research. The trick is, though, that let's say the trial requires you to come to clinic a lot more than you would have had to if you're just getting the standard of care, and now you're paying for parking, that maybe you wouldn't have paid for, or you're driving on a day you wouldn't have been driving. Those costs, unfortunately, usually end up hitting the patient. Parking more often than you would have had to, coming more from a distance to get there. There are some trials that will reimburse patients for these extra expenses of transportation. But I will say that is not uniformly the case. And that's where sometimes it can become a little tricky, particularly if the trial's far away from you and it's costing you more to get there. And so those are, I sort of think of them as a bit of hidden costs that can occur. So, again, those are just some of the common questions that I get asked. But we're happy later on today to take any other questions that you may have. But I'll pass it back to Karen for the next part of the program.
Sheila, let's go ahead and we're going to move to Sheila first, and then we'll go to Karen. So Sheila, if you'll share a little bit of your story with our audience, and go ahead, the floor is yours. I'm sorry.
So first, thank you to Sisters Network and Ms. Karen. You paved the way for people like me to be able to lift my voice for the voiceless. So I appreciate you and I thank you. So back in 2009, I was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. And the reason, a little backstory, as Colleen said, my mom died of breast cancer in 2004 that had spread to her lungs, which I didn't know metastatic and stage 4 meant the same thing. And I didn't realize there were 4 stages to breast cancer, nor did I know that Black women got breast cancer, because you look at the commercials back then and there were only white women represented. So like I said, there was a lot that I had to learn about breast cancer when I got it, because I didn't want to, I just didn't want to look at it or know about it when my mom died. But then 5 years later, I received it in 2009, a diagnosis, like I said, that spread to my liver and ribs. And the reason why I found out that I had it, because I sneezed and it hurt. And I'm like, well, that's weird, because I was active duty military and I was sitting at my desk and I sneezed again, and it was like this pain. So I went to my military doctor and I was just like, something don't feel right. And I thought it was my breast. And I had been getting mammograms since my mom had died. And she said, no, breast cancer doesn't hurt. Well, no, breast cancer doesn't hurt, but when you're metastatic, yeah, it does hurt. So I did my mammogram, and I knew right then, the lady told me to sit down. The military has never told me to sit down in a mammogram. And the radiologist called me in, and he said, then they made me I had to do a biopsy, and everything just went so fast, and I had to do an MRI. And he called me in, and he actually showed me. He said, you see this white stuff in your breast? He said, that's breast cancer. And he said, what you were feeling was every time you sneeze, the breast cancer was pressing up, the cancer was pressing up against your ribs. So basically, I found out I had breast cancer from a sneeze, which was good because it was metastatic, and I had to retire from the military. And for 9 months, I didn't know any support groups. I didn't even know they had breast cancer support groups in St. Louis. So for 9 months, I was alone, going into the hospital every week for chemo, and I was by myself. And finally, my surgeon took an invested interest in me, and she sent me this letter. She said, Sheila, I really want you to attend this symposium in St. Louis. And that's what started my advocacy, because she took an invested interest in me. And that's what started my advocacy and finding out what support programs. And I vowed then that no woman or man would ever be alone when fighting breast cancer. So, and that's when I looked up Sisters Network, and I was like, wow, this is a whole different world. So it was a good thing. And, it's been 11 years. And I've had 4 progressions. In July of 2018, I had my 4th one, which is my 4th rib. That's what they're looking at. And my doctor came to me and she said, well, we got this clinical trial. I want you to try it. It was not a last resort, because I could have went on another standard of care. And the first thing I was like, well, am I going to be a guinea pig? What are they looking at? I didn't know. So we talked, and I just had the confidence in her. And she introduced me to my clinical trial coordinator. And we talked, and I have the best team, like Dr. Trainees said. It's like it takes a team to keep me alive. It's not just my oncologist, but everybody around me that I always say that God sent, that is keeping me alive. And we talked about the clinical trial, and 3 years later, I'm still on the trial, and I'm still stable. I just had my scan last week, and I'm still doing good on it. So that's when 3 years ago, I was just like, man, I need to get this out into the Black community. And I need to get this out to researchers and the FDA or whoever I can talk to, that to make sure that Black women are asked about clinical trials, that we're educated about clinical trials, and that doctors, even when they ask, to make sure that patients are asked, especially, Black patients, because sometimes we don't get asked, and to make sure that everybody has the same standard of care that every other race. As we're dying faster, our mortality rate is higher than any other race. So I want to know myself, how long are we going to stay at 42%? We need to, and I think clinical trials is one of them. And when she asked me, like I said, 3 years later, I'm still doing good on it. It'll be 3 years at the end of July. And I'll just promote it. You can go ask your doctor. Like the Dr. Trainees said, if you're metastatic, you won't get a placebo. I hear people, well, I might get a sugar pill. I was like, no, they're not going to do that to you. And there are so many other, and I know mistrust in the medical system and things of that nature, but there are so many other placeholders in place right now, like IRBs, and I can go on and on, but that are in place that protect the patient. And as I always tell my doctor, and I talk to her, like, we need to make these consent forms easier, because I'm on my 4th consent form. And yes, the clinical trial, I go every 3 weeks, and sometimes I'm there for 9 to 12 hours, but it's so worth it, because I will be helping other women have a better quality of life. The side effects, like the doctor said, are terrible sometimes, but in the end, like my doctor always tells me, that with the good side effects, there's some bad side effects. So, and we always laugh. So I'm glad that I have a good relationship with my oncologist. And, I always say, be your own advocate. And our doctors work for us. I don't, you're supposed to be helping me, and I laugh with my doctor about that too. But yeah, so clinical trials, like I said, it wasn't a last resort, and we just sent around a survey about clinical trials. When Black women see these surveys, we need you to take them because we need to know are you even being asked about clinical trials? We need this information to make it better for the community. And we need for oncologists to make sure that they know their patients, that they know that they have 3 or 4 children. Maybe they can't participate in a clinical trial, or maybe they're gonna need money to help with daycare or transportation. Maybe they don't have a reliable. So we need to make clinical trials patient-centered. Think about the patient. I say think about the patient and then the medicine, because we have to make sure that, I'm reading grants and it's just like, make sure that you're recruiting. You have Black advocates out here. So make sure that we're getting included in these clinical trials, because how will you know what effect it's going to have on Black women if we're not included in the clinical trials, period? So I'm all for them. They're good. They're furthering research. And somebody had to be on the medicine I was on before this clinical trial for it to work 8.5 years before I had to get on the clinical trial. So like I said, I'm probably taking up too much time, but but thank you. And I'm gonna promote it from the bottom of my heart because I believe in them. And like I said, 3 years later on this clinical trial, I'm still here and I'm still doing good. So I thank God for that. And I thank my awesome support system. And I especially thank oncologists like Dr. Taiho, because, we need to bring this education into the Black community for them to even just to get to the doctor to ask, what about this clinical trial? Or what about that? And one more thing too, I always say that cancer patients should automatically be signed a patient advocate so they can navigate through this, about clinical trials or about, cancer period. So they can help them navigate through having a diagnosis. But I'm working with my hospital now. I'm trying to anyway. So we'll see about that. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And Mrs. Jackson, we'll turn it over to you briefly, and then again, put your questions in the Q&A area, and Bernadette will start feeding those to our panelists as soon as Mrs. Jackson is done, because we want to have that engagement. Go ahead, Mrs. Jackson.
Thank you, everyone, so far. Good afternoon. Black Sister Power to you all. That's our new hashtag, Black Sister Power. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. A special shout out to our Detroit chapter and the president, Cecilia Pope. She's phenomenal president. And so they have won the award today for the highest participation of our chapters. So we thank you because it's so important, and especially on this subject. Also, I'd like to say we have the participation of special folks like San Antonio, Delta Sigma Theta sorority. They've come together as a group to support us today on this special topic. And a special thank you to my Soros, AKA Always Got My Back, and the links, and I can go on. The Sigma Gamma Rho ladies, you are special. You are a partner to our national organization, and you show up when you need to show up. So we thank these groups that support us. And it's important to know, ladies, that what I call Black Power, Black Sister Power, our new hashtag is because you show up and you don't act out, but you do show up. So we appreciate all of you. I'm very excited to introduce today Sister's new social media initiative. We know that social media is important in our community. So we've taken the lead in having a social media initiative. It's called Sisters Network, Inc. News You Can Use. This series is a continuum of this important topic, the Black women and clinical trials. You can follow this initiative through our Instagram and website. We have series 1 and 2 that we're going to use as an example, and this is just the beginning. There are 12 series in total. So I'll begin with the one on the screen. Where are all the Black women in breast cancer clinical trials? An excellent startup of our series 1. Black women are repeatedly underrepresented in these studies. Increasing Black women's participation in oncology clinical trials is essential to answering complex questions like these, but individual and systematic barriers muddle the situation. And you've heard some things talked about through Dr. Delaney and also Sheila. The second series is very important, and it's on the second series should be on the screen. Where's the disconnect? Series number 2. Despite comprising only 13% of the total population in the United States, Black Americans represent just 5% participation in all medical trials and 4% of these participating in oncology trials. Let's look at why clinical trials are essentially important for Black women and the considerations necessary to improve participation. So today, your participation in answering the polls and asking the questions directly to beautiful Sheila and Dr. Delaney will be able to come up with some answers, and maybe we'll be able to assist some researchers from today's clinical trial presentation, because you ladies, I know from past experience, you will ask the right questions and you demand good answers. So we hope that today's presentation and survivor story will help you be better at clinical trials understanding. Back to you, Colleen.
Well, thank you again, panelists. And we've got some really robust dialogue questions that have been entered into the Q&A area, and I think a few were entered into the chat. So I know Bernadette has been capturing them. So Bernadette, if you want to get started, and Bernadette is part of the Detroit chapter and is always a wonderful, wonderful volunteer helping us with the Q&A. So we appreciate you, Bernadette. Go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Colleen. So for the panelists, what do you think the FDA can do better to help Blacks become more aware of clinical trials for breast women?
Maybe Dr. Delaney?
Yeah, I'm happy to start out with that. I think it's complicated, and I think there are probably a lot of things we all can do to improve clinical trial enrollment. And I will say that this is certainly a major challenge with Black women, but also, across the board with women in general. I think the challenge is that if you look at the number of patients who participate in oncology clinical trials in general, it is very low. And I think a large part of this stems from education about what clinical trials are, because I think there's a huge mistrust out there about clinical trials that I think scares patients. I think people think they're going to be treated like a guinea pig. And, I think there's this fear that this is really just something for people as a last resort. And so I think a lot of this needs to stem from better education about what clinical trials are, and let people realize that this is a way to get drugs sometimes that are really very efficacious drugs that are often even better than the standard therapies, and get them earlier. And so, it can be of tremendous benefit to you and not only just future generations of women ahead of you. And so I think the first step is education, but I think the second step is making this easier, which is something I think we do all need to work towards. And I think we alluded to this, is that sometimes clinical trial requirements are a lot, and it's a lot if it's hard to get to that clinical trial center. It's a lot if it's costing you money to park. It's a lot if you've got to figure out what to do with your children for childcare while you're getting your treatment. So there's a lot of extra things that I think we need to think about how to do better. And there are lots of efforts being put into place to do this, about how to figure out how to cover these, what I call hidden costs of, parking, spending a longer time at the cancer center than you may normally have had, who's taking care of your kids, and what happens with your time away from work. And so I think we need to do better with making clinical trial requirements also easier. And I think we learned a lot during the pandemic, actually, about a lot of tricks that can be done to make trial participation easier without losing any safety from doing so. So the introduction of telehealth to me was huge. and it allowed a lot of my patients and saved them a ton of time from coming to the cancer center. Being able to ship investigational therapy was something we were never able to do prior to the pandemic, but people were on oral drugs through a trial. I was now able to ship them to the patient during the pandemic, and they could get their labs checked locally. So I think we need to ease some of the requirements of clinical trials, maintain the safety, but make some of the steps a little bit easier. So I think, again, it's twofold. One, improving education, but two, really trying to think about how we can improve clinical trial feasibility overall.
Thank you. Dr. Delaney, do you keep the same medical team when you're in a clinical trial?
So that's an excellent question. And I will say, sort of, and it depends. So for example, when I put a patient on a clinical trial, for the most part, it's still me who's their doctor when I enroll them onto the trial. But as we talked about, they also usually gain other members to their team, members from the research staff. So in our case, the way our group functions is it's usually a research nurse that they gain. Sometimes there's a different research coordinator, a different research scheduler. So there's often a team behind the scenes also that's working on the research trials. And so in fact, usually patients like it because they gain an extra sort of support system on the trial. There are some cases, however, where at our institution, at least, and every institution is a little different, that when you go onto a particular clinical trial, sometimes there are only certain physicians who are treating on them. So for example, at our center, we have a phase 1 group that's dedicated to phase 1 trials. And so if I put a patient onto a phase 1 trial where only a certain number of investigators can be the doctor on that study, then sometimes that patient has to change doctors. That's pretty unusual. We'd like to avoid that because obviously you get to know your oncologist and you feel comfortable with them. And honestly, as an oncologist, that's a part of my job that I love the most is being able to treat patients over time. And I don't like to lose them at any point in time, but every once in a while for safety reasons, you know, for particular trials, we have to have just a limited number of doctors on them. And then in that case, you would have to change, but that's pretty unusual. For the most part, you keep your team. And in fact, you just gain members of your team.
Okay. Do you have to be a current patient to be involved in clinical trials?
So you don't, like, for example, if you're not, let's pretend you're not a patient at Dana-Farber, but let's pretend you wanted to go on to a clinical trial at Dana-Farber, but you weren't a regular patient there. That's fine. You just come to Dana-Farber and enroll on the trial and you establish care there. So it's not that you had to be a routine patient at that center. You can, but you would have to get an oncologist at that center where the trial is taking place to get your care. There are very few trials where you don't have to be at a treating center. You usually have to be getting the trial as part of a center that's participating in the study. And so, you know, it depends, for example, if you're where you get treated, if the trial is open there, but if it's not, then you could go to a site where the trial is open and go on to that study and use the oncology team at that facility for your treatment.
Great. Let's see, we have so many questions.
Yeah, we do have a lot of questions. One is about age restrictions, and then also, can you participate after you finished your standard treatment of care?
So with age restrictions, for the most part, no. In a sense that for, you know, I'm an adult oncologist, so most of our trials require that you be 18 or older, but usually aren't more specific than that. Every once in a while, though, we have a trial that's studying something in a particular population. So let's say, you know, for example, recently we were doing a couple trials in older patients. How you define older obviously varies, but some of the trials have defined it as a cutoff of 70 or older, for example. And so we had a couple trials where the drug was just being studied in patients of that age. But for the most part, again, those are more rare trials that are trying to answer a specific question in a particular population, but most trials generally for adults are 18 and older.
Okay. Are there times when you've had to take a patient out of a clinical trial study?
Yeah, no, there have been times when patients will come off of a trial. Again, that's pretty unusual. Usually the most common reason a patient would come off was if the drug wasn't working for them, then we would come off, just like as if you were in a standard therapy. If it wasn't working, we would stop it. Another reason would be is if you weren't tolerating it well. So, if you're having side effects and we tried to reduce the dose and that wasn't working to reduce the side effects, and if we had tried a bunch of other medications to really take care of the side effects, and again, that wasn't working, then every once in a while, again, if that drug's not well tolerated, that would be another reason to come off of the study.
Okay, just really quick, let me insert. We are getting close to the time that we're supposed to end, and we might just go over maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, if you all can allow that, because we have some really great questions. While we're trying to wrap up some of these questions, Shadala will launch the poll, and if you could all please fill that out. It's a very quick poll, but we love to get your feedback. And Sheila, if you could just give us some of your advice, since you have done a trial, just give us two words of advice to ladies who are maybe on the fence of participating, that from your personal experience. And yes, this will be replayed for the person, Catherine Hawkins, who asked. It will be replayed on Sisters website as well as Facebook Live. On Facebook. Go ahead.
Some advice I would give is to ask your doctor about clinical trials, get educated about clinical trials. And like I said, they work. As Dr. Trainees said, I'm there every 3 weeks, and I'm there from 9 to 12 hours. I get EKGs. I've had my heart checked so many times. Like the standard of care is and I get my eyes checked like every 2 months. And they explain to me why that I have to get my eyes checked. Apparently, if one person on the trial complains about their eyes, they're going to check everybody's. So if I'm right, Dr. Trainees, but just be patient with the trial. I have side effects. The nausea is sometimes really bad, but I work with my doctor. She even brought in a pharmacist to try to pinpoint what I should be taking for the nausea, and we figured it out, and now it's kind of good now. But just continue to ask your doctor about them, and don't be scared of them. Like I said, there's so many placeholders in place right now, so many regulations that hopefully prevent medical mistrust. And if you don't feel that's the right doctor for you, switch. Make sure that you're comfortable in your treatment. And even if you go on a clinical trial, you're going with the best decision that you have to make at that time. Right. And that's what I did. I went out with the best decision. It wasn't even if it, God forbid, it wouldn't work for a year, it was my decision, and I went with what I had at that time, and I don't feel bad about it at all. So, and you can call, text, Facebook, whatever, ask me about clinical trials, and I would tell you, girl, go on, get on one. And if you don't like it, you can get off. I have a great medical team. My medical team is awesome. Clinical trial coordinator, and they can't do anything without my oncologist's permission. They'd be like, even the vaccine, when I asked about the vaccine, I was like, hold up, let me ask your doctor first, Then they have to ask the PI, just.
I'd also like to interject that Sisters Network can help anyone with their clinical trial and helping to make decisions, because we can ask the questions that maybe you can't get the answers to. We can be your advocate in different ways. Whatever is needed, we'll try to make sure we can help anyone with their clinical trial.
Okay, the poll is still going on. If you all, we'll keep it open another maybe 2 minutes or so. Your feedback is very, very important. I see that someone had asked about starting a chapter in Seattle, Washington. Give our office a call. We'll walk you through the process. We love to expand our footprint, particularly on the West Coast. So we don't have as big of a presence of Sisters Network on the West Coast. And so we would love any ladies who are interested in helping us do that. We would welcome that discussion. I'll let you, Bernadette, take on a few more questions, okay, and we're going to try to wrap it up.
Okay, what can be done to educate medical trainees, residents, fellows about the bias, disparities in clinical trials, and the importance of asking Black women to participate in clinical trials?
I think that is such an important question. And I will say there is a huge movement, because I think we've realized that there is implicit bias that exists, and it is really important that everyone get trained on that. And so this is actually part of our routine medical training, and one that we actually get retrained on a regular basis now. And, it is such a critical piece. And I think we just need to keep working on educating.
Okay. Are there any trials to assist with reoccurrences of breast cancer?
Yes, so there are lots of trials with this focus in mind. When someone, let's say, has even finished all their therapy for their breast cancer, sometimes there are trials looking at doing extra treatments to help prevent recurrence. So for example, now we have a trial looking at a vaccine, after someone's finished all their treatment. It's, a vaccine that's given periodically to help try and prevent recurrence. So it is a huge area of interest, and, one that I think, I hope we will continue to really work towards reducing rates of recurrence with all these novel strategies.
Okay, wonderful.
Let me just give a quick shout out to one of our board members. She is always tuning into our webinars, Judy Faustin, who is a board member, works very hard for us. Thank you, Mrs. Faustin Stanford, for being on today. And let me just say again thank you to our sponsors, MERCK and Taiho Oncology. Without you, today would not have been possible. And Taiho Oncology, our new partner and friend, actually introduced us to Dr. Tolaney, and we are very grateful for that introduction. You have been amazing, and Sheila, you have been wonderful. So we just thank you. I think the poll has been closed. Is it still open or is it closed? I think it's closed. It's going to close in about in a couple of minutes. Let's get full participation. We're almost there. And let's wrap up two more questions, and then we're gonna wrap up the afternoon.
Okay. We have a few questions in the chat. Can you please remind us how much it costs for clinical trial participation?
So in general terms, we say it doesn't cost more than doing your standard of care, in a sense that you shouldn't be charged for things that aren't standard. So, the investigational drug needs to be provided for free. Any research blood or research tests that are done need to be billed to research. So you as a patient are not billed for that. But any standard thing would get billed to your insurance. So in essence, it shouldn't cost more than just doing regular treatment. I think the thing that, I often factor in is, as Sheila was alluding to, she's spending a longer day probably in clinic than she would otherwise if she weren't on a clinical trial, because there are all these extra blood draws, maybe some extra monitoring with heart monitoring and eye exams, et cetera. And so that's taking more of her time, right? And so that, to me, is a bit of a hidden cost, right? Because it's time away from work, it's time away from your family, extra time in the parking lot that you're paying for. And so if the clinical trial center is further away from home, more money you're spending to get there. And so those are factors that need to be thought of. Again, some clinical trials will cover that and you can get reimbursed for it, but others do not. And I think that is a challenge for some patients when those, kind of hidden costs add up.
Someone just put in the, I just finished Keytruda clinical trial that has now been advertised on Hallmark Channel, well, under the watchful eye. Are you familiar with that one, Doctor?
Yes, so there was Keytruda is also known as Pembrolizumab. So it's an immunotherapy drug that is FDA approved for metastatic triple negative breast cancer. And actually just some data came out 2 days ago suggesting that adding pembrolizumab to chemotherapy in early stage triple negative disease is helping prevent recurrence. And so we think that it will get FDA approved, hopefully by the end of this year, even for early stage triple negative disease. So, again, it's because patients participated in clinical trials that we've been able to learn this and show that these drugs can really have tremendous benefits for patients.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions and then we're going to wrap it up. Again, let me just say thanks to MERCK and Taiho, and this will be rebroadcast on our YouTube as well as Sisters Network Sisters Network website. So thank you again to all the participants, and 2 questions, and then we will end the afternoon so everyone can go and take care of their Saturday afternoon errands. Bernadette?
Okay. For all the questions that are in the chat, if you're interested in some of the questions were, how do you get involved again with the next session? So I believe that is in October, if I'm not mistaken, Colleen.
We have a couple of other activities coming up. One will be in August. We'll have a calendar of events that will be posted on the website next week. We do have a major initiative coming up in October, on October 16th, save the date. We'll be sending that out. It's called The State of Black Breast Cancer Crisis, a national town hall virtual discussion. And there will be a call to action, and we're super excited. So stay tuned. It's going to be a major initiative, and we hope that you all will tune in for that. If you're interested in starting a chapter, please contact our office. You can go on sistersnetworkinc.org and get information. There's an application and that process. For any of the survivors out there right now, our financial assistance program is still available until July 30th, where we are giving financial assistance. Please apply. The application is under programs on the website, sistersnetworkinc.org, as well as we need ladies to get your mammograms. We're paying for mammograms nationally. The application is online. We will be extending that process to allow more women to register to get mammograms. It's very important. So many women did not do mammograms last year during COVID with the lockdown. We have generous sponsors, one of which is Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, did a huge fundraiser to support mammograms specifically, along with Pfizer and some of our other sponsors. So please apply for the financial assistance, apply for the mammograms, and continue to support Sisters Network and the important work that we're trying to do in the Black community to educate our women. Is there any other questions, Bernadette?
Where can we find written information about clinical trials to give out to people?
We will be sharing this PowerPoint, and of course, there's other information if needed, you ask, and we will be able to, supply you with that.
Okay. Well, let's wrap it up for the day. I really appreciate everyone's participation. Again, this was Sisters Network Patient Education and Empowerment Webinar, Black Women and Clinical Trials Participation. I think we've had a robust and very important conversation presented by Sisters Network, MERCK, and Taiho Oncology. I want to thank our team who makes it possible behind the scenes to make things move very smoothly. Of course, under our leadership, Karen Jackson, Shadala Jackson, who is our National Program Manager, our Detroit member, Bernadette Jackson, who, no relation, who helps with all of the questions, Bridget Holden, who is our social media and Facebook Live manager and does PR for us, and our board of directors, and just our chapters who are boots on the ground. Thank you all. We appreciate it, and we know that your time is important, and we are so excited that we've had this many ladies stay on a Saturday afternoon to talk about clinical trial participation, and we think we're going to move the needle, and we know that we could do it with your support and your participation. Thank you again to Sheila McGlown, and of course to our new friend, Dr. Sarah Talani, who so graciously took our call and said yes, she'd be here this Saturday, and shared some very important information and answered great questions. So thank you again, and have a blessed afternoon and enjoy the balance of your weekend. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Black Sister Power.